Welcome to the Shadow the Stereotypes Empowerment Summit, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. This is session number 3, and we're talking about men's emotional healing. And if I had to pick one session for you to really pay attention to and learn from, it would be this one. Getting in touch with and expressing your emotions openly and authentically is the key to your happiness. Unfortunately, very few men are willing to engage in a conversation about their emotions. But since you're watching this video, I know you are the type of person who's ready. So I brought the perfect guest to join me in this all-important conversation. His name is Russell Richard, and he is a psychotherapist, a writer, a speaker, and a wonderful husband and father who is committed to supporting men in embracing new ways of being and relating as men. So let's welcome Russell to the Shadow the Stereotypes Empowerment Summit. Hello, Russell. How are you?
Hey, Michael, doing well.
All right. So you and I are both familiar with a process we call a check-in. So I want you to start by doing a check-in, because as we go through this conversation tonight, it's going to really be important to what we're going to be talking about. So let's model the check-in.
Okay. So I'll do what we call the PIES check-in, and it's a bit more in-depth, which basically stands for physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Physically, as I said right before we started recording, I'm tired. And intellectually too, I'm pretty beat. It's been a long week and a long day that started very early the last 2 days. So, and I've been pushing till about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. So they've been extra long these last couple of days. I scheduled an appointment with the doctor finally to go check on some things that probably needed to check out a long time ago. And so I feel good about that. Intellectually, I mean, I work with clients all day long. In the work that I do, it's very intellectually, you're intellectually engaged with people, and you're having to focus and really attend to what people are sharing with you and what people are communicating on multiple levels, and a lot of reading in between the lines of things. And so it's what I do, and it's kind of just a part of who I am. But I do find there are times when there's just not a lot of bandwidth left up there. So, intellectually, yeah, I'm probably kind of similar to where I am physically. Emotionally, I feel good. I'm happy. My son makes me laugh all the time. Uh, and that's so much of the source of my joy. Quick side note, my wife took him to the dentist today, and she sent me a picture of him in the dentist chair, and he is as happy as he can be. And so I told my wife, I was just like, he's happier than I've ever been at the dentist. So um, yeah, a lot of joy. I don't have, much anger, irritation about anything. Don't really have a lot of fear, or anxiety, at least that I'm connecting with right now. And I know every time you and I get together, there's not a lot of room for anything else, because the dialogue is always so engaging and deep. And so that's always a source of joy for me. So hard to connect with anything else in this moment, other than just happiness to share the time and space with you. And I guess finally, spiritually, um, I'm not so good in the classic sense of spirituality, and or at least spiritual practice. And for me, that's prayer, meditation, taking some time to get grounded and just open myself up to, what's beyond me. And so I haven't been doing a lot of that in the classic sense. But for me, a lot of my spiritual practice is in my engagement with my son, and the relationship there, and just kind of where that takes me within myself. in my spirit, my soul, and the connection there, and watching him, grow into the person that he is. There's something very spiritual in all of that for me that I'm very aware of and very connected to. I
Mm,
don't know if that makes a lot of sense to folks, but
absolutely.
uh, being a
Abs-
parent is very much of a spiritual endeavor.
Absolutely. Now, for the audience, he did what's called a pies check-in. And so in essence, what we're doing with a check-in is you're basically scanning your body just to check and get in touch with whatever feelings you may be having. And then you're kind of expressing that feeling. And as Russell just mentioned, some of the things that go along with those feelings. But it's something that as men, I think we really need to learn how to do, which is to just go in, connect, and express. And so this conversation is going to share some insights that's going to support and empower you to know that it's okay to be in touch with your emotions. So I'm going to do a real quick check-in, and I'm just feeling really joyful. A couple of reasons. Number one, I'm really excited about the summit and how it's going to positively impact men's lives around the globe. And I'm also feeling just a lot of joy, Russell, just hanging out with you. You and I go way, way back, and it is always my absolute pleasure to, number one, have these deep, meaningful conversations, which, again, I know is going to bring great value to the people who watch it. And again, just hanging out with my friend, having these deep conversations means a lot to me. So I'm checking in with a lot of joy and excitement. So, with that being said, now, Russell, I want you to introduce yourself to the audience. Tell them what you do.
Well, I am trained as a psychotherapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have a couple of other certifications. The one that I'm most proud of is the certified shadow work coach. Took me a lot of time and money to accomplish that. And it has informed my practice in ways that has really taken it to another level. And so I'm in private practice full time now. For a long time, it was more of a part-time endeavor, and then I finally took the leap and and started doing it full time. And it's a train that picked up steam and is going pretty full speed right about
Now, do you work with men and women or just men?
now. Men and women.
Men and women. Okay.
And interestingly enough, and I think we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, um, men and women of various ages and all adult, but that's been an interesting thing to work with people of a much older generation. So I'm sure we'll touch on that later.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we jump into men's emotional healing, my first question though, as a man who happens to be Black, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in general? Where do you fall?
Well, I think we all know where you fall, Michael. Excuse me. When I think about that question, there's only one answer that I can have, and that's optimistic. And the reason why I'm optimistic is because of how I've come to believe life works. Life is forward moving, life is evolutionary, and it is evolving always towards growth, higher levels of consciousness, improvement, uh, moving to a greater uh, version of what once was. And that's humanity as a whole, society as a whole, institutions as a whole, and of course, us on the individual level. And so looking at life through that lens, that if everything is moving towards or in the direction of growth and evolution, then things are constantly improving. And if things are constantly improving, then how can I not be anything other than optimistic? Now, does it move at the rate and pace that I would like? No, especially when we look at some of our larger social problems. And that can get a little bit dispiriting. And I think the other thing about being optimistic about things is sometimes we take a few steps back. And sometimes things have to regress and get worse before they actually get better. And a lot of times it's because things have gotten worse it wakes people up to the reality that, okay, a change is necessary. And without that tension and without the pain of things getting worse, oftentimes there's no motivation to do anything different to propel you into something new and better.
Mm, yeah, like that. Now, on that same note, I wrote a book titled The Cure for Onlyness, A Black Man's Guide to Joy, Passion, and Purpose. And in the book, I talk about the unique challenges we face as Black men when we are in environments where we're the only person of color in the room. So I'm sure you've had that experience. So I'm just curious how you navigate through that situation.
That's an interesting question because that has been so much of my life. From the time I was young in school and, elementary, high school, I was the one of few blacks. In elementary school, I was the only black male in my class. We had a few others sprinkled throughout the school. It was a real small elementary school. Got to high school, there was only one other black male in my high school class from freshman year to high school through senior year, and only a few African American females. Um, so it just became kind of my reality, and as I've gotten older, left all that and branched out into my adult life, my world started to look a lot different, particularly socially. But as we've often talked about, I often found myself in places where I'm kind of looking around and see who else looks like me, so that there can be some sort of connection. But, I guess as a younger person, I kind of learned how to navigate those spaces. And one of the things I'll say is that that came at a cost, because when you're a kid and you're trying to fit in, and when, particularly as a black kid, and I'll make that an I statement, in trying to fit in, I learned early on that there were certain parts of myself that I had to suppress and not be exposed, because I knew those parts weren't accepted. And so as I got into my adult life, a lot of my work was reconnecting with and embracing those parts of myself and honoring that. And but navigating those environments, for me, it's always been about being who I am, at least in my older life, being grounded in that, being adaptable, being flexible. I think that's necessary if you're going to be effective. And also just kind of being about my business. What am I in this space for? And allowing that to sort of guide me through how I act, react, and relate in those settings.
Yeah. And so the whole intention of the Shatter the Stereotypes movement is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. And so one of the things that I want to do, again, is bring awareness to the challenges that we face, and obviously, hopefully provide some solutions. And I think one of the things we may not talk about is the impact that that can have on us,
Mhm.
from an identity standpoint. And just because I know for most of my life, I was called a sellout. And I remember when I was in high school, I had a surfboard in my room, and I lived on the coast. I loved to surf. My friends would come over and they go, "Dude, what you know with a surfboard in your room? Black people don't surf." So the intention here again is to open our minds to recognize that, yeah, we have some unique challenges, but at the same time, we have the opportunity to become and discover who we really are. And that's what this is really about. But I think, as mentioned in the book, we have that experience where we're the only person in the room, and some of us may really struggle with that. So I like to ask that question just because obviously we all have different experiences, but I think it's an important question to ask as Black men. So with that being said, now let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is men's emotional healing. And I want to start by sharing my story. When I was 23, I was living the American dream. I had the house, the wife, the 2.5 kids, and all that. And by society standards, I was successful. By the age of 29, my dream turned into a nightmare because I went through a divorce, bankruptcy, a foreclosure, a deep state of depression. And I was even homeless for 2 years living out of my car. And it wasn't until I experienced all of those adversities before I realized that something was definitely wrong. And I reached a point where I had two choices. It was either get help or die. Fortunately, I decided to get help and I gained the courage to go to therapy. And it literally saved my life. So, Russell, I want to get your opinion. Why is it's so difficult for us as men to say those three important words? I need help.
Because it hasn't been made safe for us to do that. As men and women, early on we start getting conditioned along the lines of, gender roles and all that kind of stuff. And this is kind of an exaggeration, but as men, a lot of times we are expected to be superheroes. And we are expected to deal with all that life throws at us from the standpoint or perspective of invincibility. And so, if you are unable to do that, then you often get seen and perceived as weak. And no man wants to have that label attached to him. And so, needing help or being in a place where things are overwhelming or you can't handle it by yourself, a lot of times we suppress that, repress that, and we just kind of press on, trying to, in many cases, do the impossible. And so the simple answer to the question is that men struggle with asking for help because we haven't created a society where that's something that is acceptable and normal. We've created a society that's just the opposite, where it's like, no, if you do that, then something is wrong with you,
Yeah,
and that's not something anybody wants to carry.
yeah. And in one of my other books, A New Conversation with Men, I wrote about what I call the five illusions of manhood. And the first illusion is that to be a man, you must be non-emotional and disconnected.
Mhm.
Because culturally, we've been conditioned to believe that feelings are for women.
Mhm.
I don't want to be feminine. I don't want to feel, express our emotions. And I believe that is the illusion that causes most of the pain and suffering in our lives. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, because I believe the key to that is number one, if we're going to change the culture, we as men have to gain the courage to do this inner work, this emotional work. So this conversation, I think, it's up there in terms of importance for us as men. So I want to just kind of back up just a little bit, because you and I have been doing this personal growth stuff for a while. And so we're talking about therapy, but I want you to, if you could, Russell, if you give me kind of a Cliff Note version of what was Russell the man like before he began doing this inner work. What were you like?
Whew. Unconscious would be one way to put it, or semi-conscious at least. Angry, uh, and scared.
Mm,
Uh, Always carried a lot of fear. Um, but the anger part is really interesting because I wasn't one of these people that kind of went out and was just fighting and doing all this kind of stuff. But I had a good friend that I used to hang out with often, and he knew me before I started doing a lot of intense personal growth work. In particular, the MKP weekend that we talk about a lot. So he knew me before that, and he knew me after that. And in the years after that, training and in the work that I did, he would always say, "Man, you're such a different person." And he'd always say, "I used to think that you'd kill me," because he could feel and he knew the rage that lived inside of me. And it was never really expressed, but it was there. And I could feel it, and he certainly picked up on it. But he always talked about just how calm I had become and just more chilled out. So a lot of insecurities, like I said, a lot of anger, a lot of fear, and just not a lot of confidence and self-awareness of who I am, what made me who I am, why I was functioning the way that I was functioning, and a very kind of ungrounded, undefined sense of self.
yeah. And for me, I mean, I was your always smiling, happy-go-lucky, people-pleasing, approval seeking nice guy. That was the mask that I wore most of my life. Everything I did trying to get other people's approval and trying to get people to like me. And on the surface, it looked like I was a successful guy. But internally, there was so much shame. There was so much fear, sadness, that when I was living that dream, if you will, I was completely unconscious of any of this. So it wasn't until my divorce and everything that I had to wake up. And so that's what this conversation is about. It's about waking men up and recognizing that we're not perfect. We're just two guys that have done a lot of work, and we're going to share some information that I'm absolutely certain that can enlighten you if you're open to it. And with that being said, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt you, but we do that. I just had a thought based on something you said earlier about uh, asking for help. And the difficulty of asking for help. One of the things I tell people all the time, men and women alike, is that life is too big and life is too complicated to think that we can do this by ourselves, and to think that we can handle everything that gets thrown at us over the course of 80 or so years on the planet without the support of anyone else. And that goes into a deeper conversation about just how things are interconnected and how we need one another. And if you go back even further, that's ultimately why people banded together in communities in the first place, is because it served a survival value to rely on other people or have other people you can rely on. So I look at that, and it's like there's just certain realities about life and about being human, and life is bigger than any one of us, always.
Yeah.
And we'll never get through it totally by ourselves.
Right. And I guess one of the things I struggle with the most, and this was obviously driven by shame, but in my head, I rationalized that no one could understand my pain.
Mm.
No one could understand my pain because I had possibly the worst childhood a person could have. And so, as a defense mechanism, I built all these walls. But I think one of the things that really drove my isolation and my fear of being vulnerable and sharing, because I thought, you're not going to understand what I've been through. You're not going to be able to relate. And I think that's a trap that men get caught in, thinking that nobody's going to understand their pain. And rest assured that, yes, someone else can understand your pain if you're willing to share that pain. So Russell, I want you to jump into the big F word, because that's what this conversation is about. And the F word is feelings. And as mentioned, we live in a culture that has conditioned us as men not to feel. So Russell, if you could kind of break it down, what are they? Why do we have them? What's this thing feeling? What are they for?
Well, cool. Yeah, there's feelings and emotions, and I get that question a lot. What's the difference between feelings and emotions? And we often use those concepts interchangeably. I do all the time. And the difference is, like with feelings, we can use the word I feel sick, or I feel tired, or something that's speaking more to what's going on in your physiological body. And we do feel those things. We do have a felt sense of fatigue and of illness in the body. But whenever I'm asking people about feelings, I'm actually talking more about emotion. And so I'll often make that distinction. It's like, I'll say, well, how you feeling today? And then they'll give me something. It's like, well, hold on a second. Let me ask you this. What's your emotion? And but I still do use the concepts interchangeably. And feelings, I look at it simply. I characterize it in very simple terms, maybe too simple. And feelings and emotions are basically signals that arise in us, or energy that arises in us in response to certain situations and triggers. And so essentially our emotions is just basically energy. And I know this whole idea of energy and motion has been out there for a while, but I like it. And I always use it because there's a trigger, and then there's this energy that starts to move through the body. And those energies can have various flavors to them, is one way that I often describe it. You know, and the emotion of sadness is going to feel very different than the emotion of anger. You know, the emotion of joy is going to feel very different than the emotion of fear. And so these energies that start moving through us are essentially signals that are alerting us to some action that we need to take to bring ourselves and our situation back to a place of harmony. That's
Now,
the simple answer to that question.
now, I remember when I first started this process, and as mentioned, I decided to go to therapy, and the therapist showed me a picture of 5 little faces with the 5 emotions on it. And she asked me to identify the feeling of each face. And I couldn't do it. I literally couldn't connect to the feeling of these 5 little faces and the emotions associated with them. And
Mhm.
so it was a result of that traumatic childhood that I talked about earlier. And so I believe what happens is when we're kids and we experience trauma, and I'll just say trauma is just when some shit happens and it kind of hurts. You know, that's kind of what trauma is, right? So for me, what I did as a result of that trauma is I disconnected from my feelings as a defense mechanism. So I couldn't feel the pain that I was experiencing in that abusive environment.
Mhm.
So I think it's important, Russell, just kind of touch bases on the primary feelings, emotions, if you will, and let's just kind of break them down. I just want to get basic. So start there.
Okay. And that's an interesting question too, because when you do an internet search, there are a lot of different systems of that classify emotions and define what they are, so on and so forth. So what I'm sharing right now is not sort of the end all be all of how people view this, but you know, of course, we can start off with happiness. We can then there's sadness, there is anger, there's fear, shame, guilt, surprise, and disgust. And I also saw where contempt is considered a feeling, similar to disgust, but slightly different. And the ones that I tend to focus on are those real core, you know, mad, sad, glad, you know, uh, afraid, shame, guilt. The kind of the ones we learn in elementary school, basically, because they're really core and really primary. Um, and so I like to start off with sadness. You know, sadness is about loss in most cases. I think also sadness is about compassion. Because think of how you feel when you watch those commercials about the abused dogs or the starving children. Those things touch you, and they can bring a tear to your eye. They can cause you to feel sadness, because and that's more of a sadness that comes from a sense of compassion around someone suffering. Um, so compassion, loss. You have anger, which is oftentimes around boundary. Some boundary has been crossed in some way. You have anger that comes up around injustice, what we often call righteous anger. Um, and you can have anger that comes from, like I said, getting something that you didn't want or not getting something that you wanted. Um, so there's angers about a lot of different things. And then you have fear. Fear is basically about threat. You know, guilt, of course, is about I've done something that violated my morals and values. And so I'm feeling as if I've done something wrong. Now, the key to that is I violated my morals and values, not yours. Because a lot of times people will try to make you feel guilty about things you don't necessarily feel guilty
Right.
about. And and so we have to be careful because people can try and manipulate us that way. And then there's shame, which is feeling a sense of unworthiness or something that is defective in us. Um, and so with these emotions, there's an upside to them or a positive side to these emotions, and there's also a toxic side to these emotions. And we often talk about toxic shame. I think John Bradshaw did a lot of work on that, and kind of the person who's doing a lot of the work around shame now is I just lost her name. It'll come to me. Brene Brown. She's doing a lot of the work around shame nowadays. But one of the things I invite my clients to do when we start talking about emotions or we're not talking about them, imagine what it would be like if you did not have the ability to feel these emotions. Now, of course, everybody would sort of object to not being able to feel happiness. And if anyone's ever been depressed, they kind of know what that feels like. It's just more of a numbness or dull feeling. It's the absence of happiness. But most people will be like, no, I want to keep happiness, but I'll get rid of all the other stuff. And so let's start with grief. If we didn't have the capacity to feel sadness and grief, then that would mean that our relationships are meaningless.
Yeah.
Because we feel that sense of loss because those people meant something to us.
Mhm.
And so all of our relationships would be disposable. We would oftentimes lack compassion as well if we didn't have the capacity to feel that sense of connection to another person. So if we didn't have the capacity to feel anger, people would walk all over us. I always talk about Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. For anybody who's a Simpson fan out there, he just walked all over all the time. Um, and so we don't have the capacity to set boundaries, and we just kind of give and give and give and allow things to happen to us that shouldn't happen to us. Because anger is that signal that's connected to our territorial instinct that says you're either in my physical or emotional space and you need to get on the other side. Um, with fear, and this is a big one with men and boys, is this whole idea of being fearless. I'm not scared of anything. I can't tell you how many times I heard that. I'm not scared of anything, blah, 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 blah. The idea of being fearless, to me, is foolish. Because if you understand what fear is about, it's about threat or danger. And if you lose the capacity to understand or discern where there's threat and danger, you become both self-destructive and destructive because you have no signal that says, I probably shouldn't do this, or that could cause me some serious harm if I do. You know, Guilt and shame, if we don't have those emotions, we're basically psychopaths and sociopaths. We have no conscience. And we go through life just kind of doing whatever we want to do just because we feel like we can do it. And so that takes me to the upside of shame, because usually when we talk about shame, we're talking about toxic shame. And we're trying to engage in shame reduction work with people. But again, if we didn't have shame, then we would go around thinking that we're God and that I can just do whatever I want because I'm me. And so, the beauty of shame is that it leads us back to that place of humility that reminds me that I am human. I am imperfect. I don't get everything right. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to fall on my face. And that's okay, and it's okay because that's just how we are designed. And it goes back to that idea of life being bigger than any one person can handle.
Yeah.
And we have to accept the limitations of being human. And so the beauty of shame is that it can bring us to a place of humility. With guilt, it helps us to repair our relationships with other people because it lets us know that, okay, that really wasn't a cool thing to do. And so the response to guilt is simply making an amends and going back, taking ownership of what it is that you did that violated your morals and values, that impacted somebody in a negative way, and in offering that in a very sincere way.
Mm.
With fear, the response to fear is to assess, okay, what's the danger, what's the threat, and take the appropriate action to maintain one's sense of safety. With anger, You know, perhaps it's about a boundary, perhaps um, that there's a stance that needs to be taken. You know, all of the human rights movements that have taken place, all of the revolutionary movements that have taken place came from that place of something is not right and it needs to be corrected. And that is a function of anger. And with sadness, our task is to grieve. Yeah, it is to allow ourselves to feel the loss of what was once there.
Yeah.
And that can be a person, that can be a place, that could be a phase of life. You know, there are many different types of losses that we experience through the course of life. And there's grief work to varying degrees that are important to do with each one of them.
Yeah. Now, I hear a lot of times, and I still see this, and it makes my skin crawl every time I hear somebody say it, but I hear this a lot where a Black person will say something to the effect of, my parents used to whoop my ass and I came out okay.
Mm,
Now, from my own experience, again, I had an extremely traumatic, abusive situation, but I can't remember a single time in my childhood where an adult asked me how I felt about anything and helped me understand that my feelings were important and needed to be validated. My judgment is collectively, as Black folk, we have a tendency not to really talk about this. Again, this is just my judgment.
mhm.
So we all know what denial is. I'm curious, in your professional opinion, do we have a collective sense of denial about dealing with emotions?
Ooh, good question. When you phrase it in the context that you offered, yeah, I think in many cases we do, in many circumstances we do. And man, if you ever want to get Black folks riled up, have a conversation about spanking,
Yep.
uh, or beating the hell out your kids. And it's one of those things that in our community we seem to be very attached to. And so, again, I'm not beyond giving my kid a pat on the butt every now and then just to get his attention. Um, but you have people that approach this whole idea of physical discipline, you know, and take it to the extreme of abuse, kind of what you were sharing about. And even if it's not abuse, it's close. And and one, there are a lot of effective ways to go about parenting, but when I hear the passion that people have about beating their children, what it triggers in my mind is the slave master beating the crap out of the slave to keep him in line. And we all know the impact that that had in that context. And what I often say is that yes, being a parent is a different context, but the impact on the child can often be the same in terms of killing that child's spirit,
Yes.
uh, or in terms of creating someone who becomes filled with rage. Because nobody likes getting hit. I don't care how old you
Right.
are. Uh, and denying the impact of that on the child, one, in terms of how that child begins to see themselves, and also how that's affecting that child emotionally, because it's going to have an emotional impact.
Right.
If you hit me, I'm going to be pissed. You know, even now, when I tap my kid on the butt, he tries to tap me back. So he's 3, so it's kind of cute. But you know, that instinct is in us that says, well, wait a minute, this is my territory here. When that's violated, that has a profound impact on us. And when we have nowhere to go with that emotional energy that comes up around that, when we have nowhere to go to talk about how it feels, or anything we experience in life as children, how it feels, then we just carry it and we hold on to it.
Yeah.
And it finds its expression in ways that we're often not aware of.
Mm. Yeah, and so I have been accused of trying to be white because I refused to spank my kids. My former wife and I, that was one thing that we really disagreed on.
Mhm.
And you know, the experts will say that if you experience a traumatic childhood, most people repeat the same pattern, but some do the complete opposite. I did the complete opposite.
Mhm.
I made a commitment that when I had kids, I was not going to treat my kids the way I was treated. I feel blessed to have made that choice. Um, but I know that there's still this stigma out there collectively that we sometimes view parenting from this perspective as something white people do. We need to change that conversation. We need to understand the impact that these beatings are having on the emotional and psychological development of our kids. And I
Yes.
think that's something that is so needed
Mhm.
in our communities that we need to talk about.
Right.
So
Well, I mean, it boils down to understanding kind of how human beings are made up. And we may be Black, we may have a different cultural context, but at the end of the day, we are still impacted as human beings in the same way that anybody from any other culture.
right,
And so understanding that and embracing that, which I think is changing, embracing what it means to be human, how we function, particularly psychologically, as we become more educated around that, and as more information gets out to the masses around that, I I I I, I can only be hopeful that there's going to be a change. And as you said, you saying that you chose to do something different with your kids is something I hear a lot with my clients. Is that, yeah, I know what that was like when I was a kid. And my wife and I made a commitment that we would not parent them.
yeah. And so again, the optimist in me says that there is a shift,
Mhm.
a collective shift that we're recognizing that. I remember when people first started talking about giving a kid a timeout. I remember some of the conversations that Black folks were having about putting their
Still
kids,
have.
yeah, about putting their kids in timeout. Well, I put my kids in timeout,
Mhm.
and it worked. I mean, I just made that choice. So Russell, now I want to talk about healing because we talked about feelings, we talked about emotions, and yes, trauma impacts how we feel. But I want to talk about this process of healing, which I think, as men especially, we
Mhm.
must be willing to engage in. So, again, from my perspective, I looked at and dealt with all that trauma that I experienced because I hid behind this motivational thing for so long that I didn't allow myself to truly feel and heal. But it wasn't until I got in touch with John Bradshaw, as you mentioned, and did his inner child workshop, that was the most profound experience of my life. Because in his workshop, I actually got to the cause of my behavior. I came to an understanding of why I was the way that I was. What was driving me to be successful? What was driving me to be this happy-go-lucky, people approval seeking, people pleasing, approval seeking guy? And it was that shame. It was that toxic shame which had been driving my life. And so, in healing that shame, then I became, I'll use the word authentic. I stopped hiding behind these masks and I got in touch with who I really am as a human being. And that's the healing process. So, for those who are watching, I just want you to just kind of touch bases on number one, just the process of healing and what a person can expect when they choose to go on this healing journey.
Wow. Um, what can a person expect? Well, the first thought that comes up is in a therapist's office. that I went to, I saw a sign that said, "Nobody said it'd be easy, just worth it." And I'd never seen that quote before, and then I've seen it everywhere since then. But I think that's the first thing, is that it's not necessarily an easy process.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it can be profoundly painful and difficult, but it's always worth it. And so when I work with people, you know, in the initial session, I always start off by asking folks, "Do you have any questions for me?" And then I ask if they've ever done any kind of work like this before. And then I go about outlining the process of how I work. And in the first session, it's basically history taking and getting as much of a picture of that person's life as possible. And at the end of that first session, I always ask, "So what it is that you would like to get out of this process? You know, what are your goals? What's your vision? How is it that you want to be on the other side of this?" Because that kind of guides the process and drives the process. And a lot of times that with most of us, there's any number of things that we can work on and address. And sometimes when people come to see me, there's a very specific narrow focus that they have. And they may be aware of, and I may be aware of all sorts of other things that are there. But it's like, no, I'm here to address this piece. And then we focus on that and understand it and try to figure out what's the best interventions to address that and get them what it is that they came for. Um, when we're talking about a more in-depth kind of personal growth healing journey, a lot of times we're looking at going back into history and looking at wounds and looking at pain and looking at fear and looking at anger, looking at the mask that you spoke about, and looking at how we have coped with all those things. And we always honor that because all the things that we did to survive what has happened to us has done just that. It's allowed us to get to where we are right now. But most of the time, when people choose to go on this journey, there's been a realization that something is no longer working. And so we have to go on that journey of exploring that. And as I said, that can then take you back into some territory where there is some trauma, you know, where there is grief, where there is pain. Um, and we go back, we go into that, start talking through it and working through it. And there's many different techniques and approaches to help people process through those experiences.
Yeah. And I think it's important what you said at the beginning was it's not an easy process. There are some people that have the belief that I don't need to dig up old wounds. Why do I want to go dig up that stuff? To which I say, if you don't dig it up, it's going to come out sideways somewhere else. So this process that we're talking about, this healing process, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. The benefits of doing this work and healing. For me, the benefit of is feeling joy. Mm-hmm. authentically. To come to an understanding that I don't have to do anything, I don't have to have anything to be loved. I can be loved just for who I am. So many times I hid behind my stuff, and again, trying to get other people's approval. So the benefits to me is, first of all, waking up to who you really are, understanding that life was meant to be good, but nobody said it would be easy. But to know that there is a part of you that can move through anything, that can support you in this process. You have something in you. Now, I choose to call that something divine intelligence. There's a divine intelligence I think that we're all linked to, that if we access it, it can help move us through this process. And my experience has taught me, as a former atheist, that having a connection to that divine intelligence is extremely important as you work through whatever you're working through. So I want to, as we start winding down here and talk about healing, I want you to recognize that it's possible for you to move through anything. Don't get trapped like I did, thinking that nobody's going to understand your pain. No one's going to support you and be there for you, because there are people out there like Russell and lots of people out there who will support you. But I think it's important for us to, first of all, just have the conversation with ourselves about how we feel. Because after my divorce, I had this amazing pattern, and the women were all saying the same thing. I care too much about you to stay in this relationship. And the reason I'm not staying in this relationship is because you're emotionally unavailable, which made absolutely no sense to me at the time. But in essence, what they were saying, it was my emotional unavailability, which was keeping me from connecting. And as human beings, that's what we long for, connection. If we're unwilling to do our healing work, connecting to our hearts, we can never connect truly. So doing this work is, I say, the reason we do this work is to learn to connect, first with ourselves and then with others. So Russell, I want you to kind of wind down. I know we packed a lot, into this short period of time, but I just want you to kind of wind down your thoughts, your ideas of, number one, the importance of getting in touch with your emotions. Number two, being willing to heal. And number three, it's all going to be okay.
I'll try and remember that, all three of those points. But I'll start with the last. I may have to ask you to remind me of the first two, but it's all going to be okay. That's something that life has taught me. That when I look back at all the things that I've worried about and stressed about, and of course I still worry and stress, I'm always reminded in the end that everything always works out. It always works out. Now, granted, I have to do my part to make things work out, but there's also a certain level of trust and faith that experience has taught me to have, and that I need to apply to the situations. And I don't worry half as much as I used to, and I don't get as stressed. Of course, certain things do come up that take me there, but I always remind myself that everything has always worked out. Um, so it's gonna be okay. And it's gonna be okay, especially if and when we do the work around whatever it may be, a lifetime of stuff. It may be a situational thing. We have to do our part to facilitate the outcomes that we want. And when we do that, it works out. And the other thing is more of a faith statement, is that even when things don't work out the way that I want them to, that whatever the outcome is, that is somehow for me. And I've learned to just surrender to that. And the value and the benefit of the outcome ultimately reveals itself to me. And it's like, okay, now I got it. Now I got it. So it's good that it turned out that way. So that I think speaks to the last one. What was the other two?
Well, actually, I think that really sums it up, because we all have stuff. We all have issues. So I think, rather than talking about, why go to therapy, why do the healing, just recognize that you have within you the ability to move through anything. And it can and will work out if you commit to the process. As difficult as it might be, you have within you the ability and the capacity to move through it. Just remember, there's no shame in saying, I need help. Know that there are people out there that can help and support you, and that it's going to be okay. I think that really sums it up. So, Russell, how can people reach you in case they're interested in talking to you about whatever issue they may be having and want to inquire about your services? How do they reach you?
Folks can reach me by email at russell@russellrichard.com. Russell, two S's, two L's, and Richard is spelled just like Richard. I'm a Louisiana guy, so it's the French pronunciation. Russell@russellrichard.com. And my phone number is 713-320-7400.
And
Website, russellrichard.com. And it has a very outdated picture of me from about 15 years ago.
and you're still handsome. But your profile below the video in the summit will also have that contact information. So for those of you who are watching, it'll be below the, just look below the video here. You'll see his contact information in case you missed it. So Russell, again, last opportunity, just final words, final thoughts. What are your final thoughts?
Well, I want to go back to optimism because I know that's a central theme of yours. And I know that optimism is a real hard thing for a lot of people to come by, especially when they're in a place of pain. And, you know, one of the things that makes me optimistic about the movement that you have and things that are happening in the world, especially in the African American community, and especially around mental health is, and I spoke about this at the beginning, is, you know, I work with people of adults of all ages, and I have had African American men in their 80s come into my office. Now
Wow.
you think about a man, a Black man who is in his 80s, when he was born, what he lived through, the generation that he came from,
Wow.
and the norms and the values that that man has grown up with and lived with. That's the generation that didn't talk about stuff. They toughed it out. They did what they had to do, and because so much of our ancestors' experience was struggle, it was about survival, and they just did what needed to be done, and there wasn't a lot of time and space for feelings and processing. That in many ways was a foreign concept.
So,
So to see these men come into my office, you know, it first was like, whoa, you know, and then it was kind of like things are really changing in this world and in our community when men of this age and this generation are willing to step into the vulnerability of what a course of therapy is, and is very humbling and also very inspiring at the same time. And for me, I think that showing one's vulnerability, admitting that a person needs help is, and again, this goes back to some of Brene Brown's work, that is one of the most courageous things that any person can do, because it takes courage to show our humanness and our imperfections and to let people know, hey man, I ain't got it all together. And I can't do this all by myself. It takes a lot of courage given the way that we've grown up and have been conditioned to do that. And much more courage than the person who's going to allow fear to cause them to be quiet. And so if a man who was born in the 30s can engage this process, then I think anybody can.
wow.
An African American men born in their 30s can engage this process, then anybody can.
Wow. That's inspiring. That warms my heart just thinking about seeing that man sitting there being willing to address those scars. And I mean, just trying to imagine what they have gone through in their 80 years. Wow, that's pretty powerful. Pretty powerful. So your takeaway from this session is the importance of emotional healing. And you must remember that those three most difficult words that we choose not to say sometimes, I need help. It's okay to say I need help. So I'm going to give you permission right now to let go of that negative stigma associated with asking for help and be willing to ask for help if needed. Understand that it is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength to seek support. And there's an infinite amount of resources available for you if you're ready to begin your emotional journey. So I want you to be sure to drop your comments below. If you got any questions, you can drop them in the comments. They will all be answered. It has been my absolute honor and privilege, Mr. Russell, to have you on. I so appreciate you. I love you. I'm so glad that we've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
It's
close to 20 years now.
It's amazing that we committed early on that we were going to empower Black men to engage in this personal growth process. So again, it is my absolute honor to be connected with you and to have you as a partner in this movement called Shatter the Stereotype. So thank you for the man that you are. So this concludes session number 3. Now get prepared for session number 4, where I'll be talking with Ralph Campbell, and we're going to be talking about change your mindset to change your life. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you next session. Take care.